Hi, this is Miss Lavoti, and in this video I'll be showing you how to work with Crayola watercolors. The classic Crayola watercolor tray is a very transparent, basic watercolor set that can be used with all ages. How can we use these watercolors with more experimental techniques to make marks with the watercolor? First, we're going to get creative with what we can make marks with. So before you get started, look around your house for some items that we can use other than regular brushes. Things like straws, plastic bottle caps, crayons, plastic wrap, sponges, Elmer's glue, hole punch stuff into a piece of paper, borrow a toy car from a sibling, you get the idea. Some of the techniques we'll try include dripping, splattering, stamping, resisting, and creating a bleed, and using salt. Before you begin, think about things like adding too much water over your color when it's applied to the paper will make your color dry very light and very dull. Using less water on your brush equals a more dry brush texture, and it's good to build up watercolor in light layers, letting watercolor dry before you move on to the next layer. Let's make a documentation page in your sketchbook to show examples of these experimental techniques. In this, I'm wetting the paper first, then I'm going to add color so that they can bleed into each other, and then I'll tilt the paper to make some drips. Normally, a bleed is something that is not something you want to achieve in a watercolor painting, but in a more experimental practice, letting colors run into each other could actually produce some cool effects. In this one, I'm mixing color in the plastic tray cover, and then I'm going to actually drag a toy car through that puddle of green, getting it all over the wheels, and then I'm going to track those wheel marks right onto my paper to create a texture. I'm also going to use a bottle cap to stamp circle patterns, again taking color from the tray cover of the watercolor. You can look for things in your house that can become a stencil, like a doily or other type of fabric that you can stamp or press watercolor through. Just make sure you don't have too much water on your brush, or else the design won't show through crisply. You can also paint directly on a surface that you want to stamp with. Anything that has kind of like a plasticky texture would work, because then the watercolor can push off of it and onto your new surface. If you have salt at home, different kinds of salt have different effects on watercolor. You would put wet watercolor down, it can't be too dry, and then you sprinkle salt directly on it while it's still nice and wet. The salt soaks up the water and gives you crystal effects. You can try a crayon resist. The wax of the crayon repels the watercolor, so you can make marks and then add watercolor and see the crayon underneath. You can also try splattering with a larger brush and sprinkling watercolor out of your paper. You can also use plastic wrap to create textures by dunking plastic into your wet watercolor. So have a color mixed and ready to go, scrunch up your plastic wrap, and then dunk it in your watercolor and then stamp it. You could also use a sponge for this. In this, you can use a glue resist. If you have regular Elmer's glue from the bottle, pour out a generous amount into a design and then let it dry completely. It has to harden. Don't paint wet watercolor over your wet glue. Once the glue is dry, see what happens. It will reveal your design when you put your watercolor over it. Once your watercolor page is dry, take a look and see what the watercolor actually looks like. So it's important to see what happens when your watercolor dries. This area had a lot of water, so the watercolor looks lighter and the edges might look darker or crunchier. You can see what happens when the salt absorbs the water. You get that crystallized, speckled effect. And wherever water might have dropped or dripped onto your watercolor, you might notice that it removes the watercolor. So the Crayola watercolor is very sensitive to water, and it will change when it's dry. Now we can make a documentation page of some color mixing and try to show color values and complementary colors. So I'm wetting my paper and I'm dragging out a gradient with one color, just trying to get the color to fade out so I could see a transition smoothly from light to dark. Having a little bit of wet paper helps kind of flow the watercolor. You can make a value scale of colors by gradually layering more watercolor on top of each other, and then you should let this dry on your sketchbook page. So I'm trying to paint light, dark, and medium values with my watercolor so I can see the transition happening from light values to dark values. So the darker the color, I want less water on my brush and I want more layers of that color. So you could do this with several different colors of your choice. So you're going to want to let that all dry, and so that way we can test out complementary colors over it and see what transparent layering looks like. While you're waiting for that to dry, you can try to mix complementary colors directly together on the plastic cover of your palette. Mixing red and green in the tray cover produces a color like this. Mixing violets and yellows will produce a different effect. So test out your color combinations and see what kind of colors you can mix together to produce different tones. It is very possible with a very simple watercolor tray like this to still produce a range of colors. Something else I'm doing is just picking two colors and making a light wash in a square shape to be able to test out other colors overlaying these. So I have like a warm brown color, and then I have this like yellowy color that I'm going to put down. We're going to let that dry, and that way we can see how other colors interact with it. So once this page is totally dry, you should write down notes about what you did and why certain colors might have dried the way that they did. So something might look okay when you're painting it, but then when it dries it looks different, and that could be because of how much water was applied at the end, or where you overlapped or scrubbed the paper too much. So taking a look at that green one there, this was too much water overlaid on the paper here, and you get those fuzzy edges and that dulled out color. Now that this is dry, you can go back and layer complementary colors over your value scale colors to see how they change. So I'm applying red and overlaying that onto some of my green colors just to see how the red changes the green. What do those colors and tones look like? Am I able to get it to look similar to the complementary colors I mixed directly in the pan? I can play around with layering color over those washes that I put down. So there's some primary colors, so you could see how they overlap to make secondary colors, and how you can intensify other warm colors with warm color. So those are some extra things for you to test out. Now I'm going in with some yellow orange to change the green, and I can also try some yellow over the violet to see how the yellow changes that. Lastly, now that the gradient is dry, I can go back and overlay more color to darken the one end of my gradient. So one of the next techniques you can try is to do a wet and wet and see if you can get two colors to blend into each other to make a gradient. So I'm taking green into yellow, green into yellow, and I'm trying to smooth them together. I blend them while it's still wet. Be careful of over blending on your paper. You don't want to scrub a hole in your paper, and then you can darken and brighten the two ends of those colors. Here's some extra tips for you. Try to be gentle with how you apply color and blend with your paintbrush. Overbrushing or scrubbing the paper with your brush will deteriorate your paper and even make holes. Try not to overwork wet areas on your paper. This will cause your paper to pill, and you will see a little paper pulp pieces on the surface. Also, gently dry up puddles with a paper towel or a dry paintbrush that you can use as your mop. This will help make sure that your project does not get too oversaturated with water.